The heptapod language was a unique problem for me as a screenwriter because when I got to talking about it, I knew how important it was in the film, and I got more and more novelistic in my description of it whenever I got to that in the script. And if there's one thing I hate, it's a screenwriter trying to be a novelist. And so I got very frustrated, and I was out to dinner with my wife one night, complaining as usual about whatever it was I was working on. And I'm like, I don't know how to make this work without just spending way too much time on the page. And she's like, well, just show me what you're talking about. And I scribbled something out that was a circular kind of cuneiform that had a few little branching things. And I said, roughly this. And she says, well, then just put that in the script instead. And I'm like, you can't put a, wait, can you put a graphic in the script?
I had bumped into Ted Chiang online. A friend sent me a link to a story that was published in its entirety on an online science fiction zine, and it was the story Understand. And I devoured that, and my mind was blown away at the end of it. I thought, this guy can write. Oh my God, what else has he done? And discovered the collection, Stories of Your Life, on Amazon, and I just instant buyed it. And then a few days later, it shows up at my door, and once again, to procrastinate, I was like, I'll just read a story. I've done a page. That's good. And then like a few hours later, I had devoured about half the book. And I had to stop at Story of Your Life because it emotionally wrecked me. Like I had this weird mix of just like feeling uplifted and hopeful and also completely shattered. And just put it down and went out and hugged everybody within walking distance and just was like, wow. And then sat back down and I thought, how can I torture a greater audience with this? How can I infect a bunch of people with this feeling?
In the story, the heptapods actually don't show up. It's not a first contact per se. It's over 100 different pieces of technology that just show up around the world that are essentially flat screen TVs, and we have Skype calls with the heptapods from like however many light years away. And that was, you know, academically interesting. No tension at all there. So the first real choice I made was to have them show up at our front door.
And instantly, that gave me a kind of a strange ticking clock. The public's need for an answer.
I knew that I wanted to make this first and foremost a story about Louise and about this relationship to her daughter, and that the second tier is the visitation. I also didn't want to build the story as, you know, like a Usual Suspects Kaiser Soze reveal of, aha, now the magic trick. I wanted to be able to tell the audience the entire story in the first few minutes or in the first, couple of pages, in at least the emotional part of it.
Of all the stuff that made it all the way, the first 5 pages and the last 5 pages stayed the same almost exactly from the first draft. I can tell you that I started writing just the mother-daughter scenes, and I did a lot of transposition from the short story because there are some lovely scenes with mom and daughter in the short story. And then I made up a few of my own, and I just had those kind of banked. And then when I started writing out the rest of the present day narrative, it was a matter of like finding out where I could insert those, what's the context for those, and how do I transition to and from them properly, because transitions are a big deal.
But now I'm not so sure I believe in beginnings and endings.
Story of Your Life, the first draft was about 3 months. It was a 3-month-long process. The very first draft, I had a whole series of scenes that were little scenelets, really, of Louise teaching very basic vocabulary to the heptapods. And Ian would demonstrate. And it was just super, like, kindergarten-level words. And they were like, Eric, this is not sexy at all. This is really boring. This is really, I don't want to, no actor is going to want to try and do it. What are you doing here? What are you doing? And I said, I don't know how to get around. Like, this is what they got to learn. Like, no, why do they have to learn this? And I'm like, fine. And I went to their whiteboard and I wrote, this is the question we're trying to get to. And here's how difficult it is. And here's how many sessions you have. And after all of that, then you have to have enough vocabulary with them so that they can answer the question. And you can't even go specific, because I said, what's a Pulaski? And they're like, we don't know. And I'm like, well, it's a tool that firefighters use. You can't start with Pulaski. You got to start with tool. And they just stared at me for a while and they're like, That's the scene that goes in the movie. Get rid of this other crap. That's the scene.
The trick that I learned from a friend of mine named John Rogers, he's a feature and TV writer. John has always been good about nesting exposition or framing it as an argument. And so if you have some sort of debate that happens among the characters and each of them is trying to defend their point by explaining why they think they're right, you're still explaining things, but it's under the context that I think it makes it more digestible. And that, I think, is why there's a scene in which Louise diagrams a sentence and defends why it's important for her to teach her the way that she is. We learn a lot about language in general through that moment that we wouldn't otherwise.
This story, this film, is a bit like building a boat inside a bottle, and you have to be very careful with the way that it was constructed. You can't just over-clarify something or oversimplify something. You can't have just a mountain of exposition. We didn't want a $40 million TED Talk, and we also didn't want to talk down to our audience and never get condescending. Having been around really smart people, scientists and linguists and other consultants that we used to make sure that this film was authentic, the way that they talk to each other is never like, whoa, speak English, doc. We never get to that. So it was about doing our best to preserve the telling of a story that was basically 2 + 2 and not saying 4. The message in Ted's story there was more about Louise embracing the inevitable. It was a very kind of deterministic realization that likely everything is predestined and you just gotta find a way to make peace with that. And I was a bit rebellious about that. I'm like, Ted, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. I think it's more profound for me if she has a choice, if she has free will and can change her future, and yet she chooses to have Hannah. That to me is more affecting, and that's really where I wanted to land on it. But if I did that, then I had to make sure it wasn't a rock climbing accident in which Louise could just call the day before and say, hey, don't go.
Denis was the most enriching relationship that I've had with a director in my career so far. And he behaved very differently from anybody else that I've been in the room with. I've been so accustomed to getting to a point where a director is attached or thinking about becoming attached. And it's a very brief meeting where, often the director will get my name wrong. And not really, it's like, look, this is the last time I'm going to see you, maybe before the premiere. And then off they go. So with Denis, though, he got interested, and everybody, all the independent financiers and my producers were all like, oh my God, Prisoners on Sandies. Dude, this is a go movie if we get him. And no pressure, Eric, but don't mess this up. And he offered, and so we had a breakfast meeting at a little spot near his hotel in Westwood. And sat down, and it wasn't like a little half-hour session at all. It went on for like a couple of hours, and we just did a deep dive on philosophy and science and religion and geopolitics, and would occasionally steer back to the script, and he'd have some questions. And at the end of it, we got up, he shook hands. He says, like, Eric, this was nice. Let's do this next week. And I was like, sure, okay, yeah, great. Every week, my producer's like, please, dear God, say he's on board. Like, no, but we had a croissant and a mocha, and we talked about politics. It was great. And he's like, what the hell are you doing, Eric? And then finally, after all that time, I got a call from my agent, like, holy crap, dude, it finally worked. He's on board. It's official. And then a minute later, Denis called me himself, and he says, all right, Eric, now we are married.
And he meant it. Like, he was the only director I've worked with where before any sort of change to the script, he would call and say, now, Eric, if I move this, if I adjust this, does this break anything?
He grilled me on every page. He grilled me, what's the subtext here in this, and what's this line of dialogue, and why did you use this verbiage in the narrative? And like he just combed through that to try and glean as much information as possible. Many drafts, it said, Louise says something in Mandarin to the general. And we were about 3 months away from shooting. And Denis calls me, Eric, what did she say? I don't know. She said something in Mandarin. I have the woman here who translates from Mandarin. She's going to teach Amy Adams what to say. what does she say? I'm like, you have to teach. Oh, right, because she's actually saying, oh, God. And she's like, Eric, this is the line that saves the world. This is the most important line in the whole movie. Eric, what have you done to me? You must find this for me right now. And I'm like, oh, God. I started sweating. I just come up with like draft after draft after draft.
And I guess it was about 24 lines later that I found a poem, and I did some alliteration so that I made it sound, I guess, more poetic. I don't know. This is pretty good. I sent it to him, and he says, Eric, I deeply love this. And so I'm there seeing it finally put together for the first time at Toronto at the Film Fest, Ted Chiang right next to me. And we get to that scene, and the bastard Denis doesn't use subtitles for any of that. Like, he's just like, throw that away. And I'm like, no! So what the dying wife's last words were, in war, there are no winners, only widows.
There's a line that was so important to me with her, and it was when she was talking about why Hannah's dad left. And I was talking about the unstoppable disease, and she said, kind of like you with your poetry and your swim trophies. And what she's talking about is her daughter's contributions to the greater world, and how she affects many other people, possibly even inspires other people. And how if you remove Hannah, even from the short time that she's there on the planet, how many other people is she affecting, possibly even negatively? And the thought about even if she knows that there's a heartache, a horrible heartache at the end of this journey with her daughter, and she's going to lose her after that time, the fact that she manages to touch other people during the years that she's on this planet, and what that effect has on everybody else, and what possibly even her loss has on her friends and the family of her friends, that there's far greater consequences to that. So there's some selflessness involved in her going through with her choice, and there's also just the fact that she would rather have loved and lost than to never have Hannah at all.
Hello everyone, thanks for watching. If you're interested in learning more about the writing process of your favorite TV shows and movies, please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time as we take another look behind the curtain.